Welcome everyone to this new episode of the Privacy Rules Privacy Espresso series. Actually, this is the first episode of 2025, so Happy New Year to you all, and thanks a lot for being with us also this year. Today, I'm with Kristen Pennington from Canada, from the law firm Macmillan LLP. Kristen is an expert on privacy and data protection, and I would like to thank her for being with us, and Happy New Year to you as well, Kristen. Thanks for being here.
Same to you, Alessandro. Thanks for having me.
The reason I'm thankful is because we have a very interesting topic to discuss about today, which is the one of deceptive patterns, which is a topic that has been pretty trending in Canada in the late fall of 2024. Indeed, you had also worked on an article that you have released end of the year, and we will be also happy to reshare in these together with this espresso. But let's go through this topic because there is a lot to say, and that was my understanding also thanks to the article. So my first question for you would be, what are we talking about? So what are deceptive design patterns?
So deceptive design patterns are patterns that are used online to influence, manipulate, or coerce a user of a website or an app into making privacy-related decisions that aren't necessarily in their best interests. So in the regulator's view, these patterns prevent users from making fully informed decisions about the collection, use, and disclosure of their personal information, and they cause individuals to give up more of their privacy rights than they might otherwise want to.
That's very clear. And in this regard, I understand that talking about mainly digital properties, so websites, apps, and similar type of areas. Can you give us some practical example on the use of deceptive design patterns in those contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually quite a few of them. One common example we refer to as interface interference, a bit of a tongue twister, but these are design elements that distract or confuse or otherwise try to adversely influence a user's perception and understanding of their privacy options on a digital platform. Another example would be pre-selection. So as the title suggests, that occurs where the most privacy intrusive option is pre-selected by default in the hope that individuals will just go along with it, right? And not take that extra step to click off and to unselect that pre-selected option. And then finally, another example of interface interference is called confirm shaming. And that's using really emotionally charged language to try to push users toward a privacy related option that favors the organization whose digital property it is. Another example of a deceptive design pattern is nagging. So again, as the name implies, this is where a digital property uses some sort of repeated prompt to try to get users and effectively annoy them into taking an action that they wouldn't normally take. So that could be like encouraging them to sign up for an account over and over again, or to otherwise permit the business to allow the collection of more personal information than they might otherwise want to give up. Another example is obstruction. So that is inserting unnecessary or additional steps between a user and their privacy related goal. So the idea there is that individuals will become frustrated by all of these extra steps and they won't make their intended privacy choice. They may just give up and sort of relent to giving over more of their personal information. And then finally, there's the concept of a forced action. And those are deceptive design elements that either require or trick a user into disclosing more personal information than is necessary to provide the service that the website or app is intended to provide. So an example there would be using a cookie banner that only offers an accept all option and doesn't, for example, provide an option to reject non-essential cookies. So those are some of the examples that Canadian regulators have flagged thus far, although I'm sure there are others out there.
And there are already many. So
Yes.
it's there is really a broad variety of ways to indeed create deceptive designs. And my next question would be how this concept can impact privacy policies for businesses having websites or apps.
Right. So on the face, you might think more of design patterns and design elements that are used on a website. But interestingly, Canada's federal privacy regulator has also considered posting an overly technical or excessively long privacy policy or terms of use on a website or app to also be a deceptive design pattern. So it's not only about visual, it's also about content that you post
Mhm.
on your digital property. And interestingly, more specifically, the regulator has said it considers a privacy policy to be excessive in length if it's longer than 3,000 words, which isn't that many when you come down to it with a privacy policy. And also they consider the policy to be unduly complex if it's drafted above a grade 12 reading level. So in my view, that's actually one of the harder pieces of advice or guidance for businesses to comply with, because businesses also have a competing obligation to make sure that they're being transparent in their privacy policies about all the different processing activities that they're undertaking. And also, they need to provide a bunch of different notices that are required by Canadian privacy laws. So I think that's going to be a tough balance for businesses to potentially strike between keeping those privacy policies concise and drafted very simply while also meeting their transparency obligations.
Yeah, this is one of the classic privacy conundrums, keeping things simple and short and at the same time clear enough. And now we have an additional layer, which is, not using those type of patterns, which, in some cases might be something that companies want to do, but in some others, they are not really aware that they are using a pattern, I believe. I mean, that's where probably experts like you can really support them even in understanding things that seems very, very simple, but are not at all. In this regard, I also like to know a bit more on the approach from the privacy regulator. So, how was the issue of those patterns first raised by the Canadian regulator?
So last year, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, which is Canada's federal privacy regulator, joined 25 other global privacy enforcement authorities, and they actually conducted a sweep of a whole bunch of different websites and mobile apps for the use of deceptive design patterns. And then the regulator published a report summarizing its findings from that sweep.
Okay, interesting. And which were the results of it?
The results are actually quite interesting. On its face, the report suggests that the use of deceptive design patterns is very widespread, so it's not uncommon. Of the 145 websites and apps reviewed by the Canadian regulator, 99% of them apparently had at least one indicator of deceptive design. So if you're sitting thinking about your own digital property and how you may have run afoul, you're certainly in good company. It's a very common problem. And interestingly, the report indicated that overly technical or excessively long privacy policies was actually the most common kind of deceptive design pattern that they saw. So during their sweep, that occurred on more than 96% of the digital properties that they reviewed.
Yeah, and I think this, relates a lot to what we were saying before, meaning that you might be using patterns of this kind even if you don't want to. So it's really
Yeah.
better to check if you are doing it or not. And this brings me to the next point, meaning which are the risks for businesses that are using patterns?
One thing to keep in mind about Canada is that, unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, our private sector privacy legislation has as its primary basis to collect, use, and disclose personal information consent. So we don't have a lot of the other helpful legal bases for processing personal information. A lot of our compliance revolves around obtaining meaningful consent. But our legislation also expressly says that consent won't be valid if it's obtained through deceptive or misleading practices. So it follows that the use of a deceptive design practice on your digital property will invalidate any consent that you otherwise may have obtained were you not using that deceptive mechanism. And that may leave a business in a position where it doesn't have another legal basis to be processing that personal information for commercial purposes. And then finally, it's possible that deceptive design patterns could result in individuals making complaints to the privacy regulators and or investigations by the regulators, and even in Canada, the possibility of seeing individual or class action litigation. So there's a legal risk there as well.
That's very quite alarming, I would say, meaning that there is a lot that can happen around the usage of those deceptive design patterns, and it's not just about the sanctions from the authority, but it's also related to the image of the company, but also the data, meaning that if you don't have data properly collected, then you cannot use them anymore, and this might be a big problem for many companies, as well as, of course, the last point related to complaints or investigations, which is always a relevant one, but even more whenever there are capabilities for individual to open class actions. So on this last point, I'd like to ask you if the Canadian privacy regulator has suggested that deceptive design patterns might be an area of potential enforcement.
Yes, they have indicated that this will be an area of enforcement. So, in fact, we know that the federal privacy regulator in Canada has sent some of its observations to businesses whose websites or apps were part of the sweep that they did. So, if your business or one of your clients' businesses has received a communication from the regulator that makes allegations around the use of deceptive design patterns, it's really important not to ignore this because it's possible that the regulator could initiate an investigation and we head down the road of some of those potential consequences that we just discussed. But also, Canadian privacy regulators have emphasized that the use of deceptive design patterns is very much on their radar by issuing a joint resolution on the topic in mid-November of last year. So the resolution calls on both public and private sector organizations to avoid the use of deceptive design patterns and to ensure that their websites and app users can make informed privacy decisions.
Okay, and is there any practical guidance in this resolution that business can use to avoid using deceptive design patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a good area in the sense that there are very tangible steps that an organization can take to avoid the use of deceptive design patterns. And the resolution sets out a number of specific expectations that the Canadian privacy regulators have with respect to online platforms. So, for example, the resolution advocates for the concept of privacy by design as the basis for website and app design. I don't think that'll particularly come as a surprise. But in terms of specifically related to deceptive design patterns, the resolution encourages organizations to ensure that they're defaulted to the most privacy protective settings on their digital platforms, that privacy choices are presented in simple, consistent, and neutral, so non-emotional or non-judgmental language, that privacy settings are available at all times and not only upon a user's first visit to the digital platform. The resolution also flags that you should be reducing the number of clicks that are needed to navigate and adjust a user's privacy choices. And finally, it advocates for the use of just-in-time consent options so that users can make privacy decisions when they're contextually relevant and again, not just upon their first visit to the platform.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Kristen. And from your perspective as an expert in the field, is there any other action item that you recommend businesses to implement to mitigate the use of deceptive design patterns in their properties?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, give that resolution a read, and that it forms a good basis for some initial steps. But also, I think that businesses should ensure that there's an internal review and approval process in place for the design and implementation of new websites and apps, as well as updates to existing websites and apps, specifically to ensure that deceptive design patterns aren't being used. And that deceptive design or that review and approval process for deceptive design should include input from the person who's responsible for your privacy compliance. That might be your privacy officer or someone in another position, and then perhaps your legal counsel as well, who deals with your privacy matters. So, for example, you might want to consider developing and delivering role-specific training to the individuals or to the teams who are responsible for developing your digital platforms or updating them. So that could be your marketing or your design teams, et cetera, to help them be on the alert for these really early in the design process. You could also consider updating any privacy impact assessment templates or other internal tools or checklists that you may have, again, to specifically assess and protect against deceptive design patterns. And then, of course, go ahead and have a look at your existing digital platforms with fresh eyes, knowing that this is an issue that's on regulators' radar. And last but not least, as we discussed, privacy policies are the most common deceptive design pattern flagged during the sweep. So it's a great time at the beginning of a new year to update those privacy policies to make sure that they're not only transparent, but they're not unduly long or overly technical.
Which is always a good practice in particular for the beginning of the new year. Kristen, we are running out of our time, so I would like to thank you very much for this very clear and interesting explanation on this topic of deceptive design patterns, I invite all our followers to, other than listening us, to read more to your article that will be linked to this Privacy Espresso episode. And I would like to thank our listeners for being with us as well. And I very much look forward to meet you all with our next Privacy Espresso. So bye everyone, and thanks a lot.